Salve omnes and welcome to this week's video tutorial. This is Dr. Thomas coming to you from Peakwave Arena this morning. Our chapter for this week is Caput 31, cum clauses, and the irregular verb fero, which occurs with some frequency in Latin. What is meant by cum clauses? Well, clause, of course, is a group of words. In English grammar, we often talk about dependent and independent clauses. And these clauses give additional information or set the stage for additional information. And in Latin, as you've already learned, cum can function as a preposition, meaning with. If so, the word that follows will be in the ablative. So you will see this is fairly easy to recognize. That is to say, cum as a conjunction introducing a clause versus cum as a preposition functioning as a prepositional phrase. For when it's functioning as a preposition, the word that follows will be in the ablative. As far as the basic meanings and translations of cum, here we have when, since, although, and it often introduces a subordinate clause, or in English grammar, a dependent clause. This chapter focuses on two different kinds of cum clauses, namely temporal clauses and as you will see, also circumstantial clauses. Temporal clause, as the term suggests, indicates some sense of time. And so a common translation for this would be when, or sometimes while. You may also see this pairing cum tum, which they say here can be translated as not only, but also. Here we have a good example. Cum eum veribus eum cognosces. When you see, or more strictly speaking, when you will see, you will recognize him. So both of the verbs are in the future tense. Here we have our bo be be boo. And because conoscere is a third conjugation verb, we don't use bo be boo, as we've talked about in previous lessons, but rather the vowel E. You can see in English, you don't need to use the future tense, just given the uniqueness of English grammar. So both of these would be correct. When you will see him, or when you see him, you will recognize him. I think in this main clause, we probably should use use the future tense. So here cum is simply functioning as a conjunction, namely when, functioning as a kind of subordinate or dependent clause. Here we have another example, cum vincimus tum pacem speres, when, or sometimes while, depending on the context. When we are winning, you are hoping for peace. So cum here functioning as the conjunction when, and this is our subordinate or dependent clause. You are indicated by S, and here is in the present tense. Spero means hope. I think we've had this word earlier. And then pacem as the accusative direct object in the third declension. So again, not too difficult, simply vocabulary, recognizing it as a dependent clause or subordinate clause. Cum ad illum locum venerant, tum amicos contulerant. This one's a little bit longer. Cum means when. Notice all these examples, we don't have a noun or adjective in the ablative case. If so, that would be introducing a preposition. And so that's another indication that we're dealing with conjunctions here. Here we have the pluperfect, so when they had come, and then to that place. And then here's that idiomatic phrasing they gave you earlier. Not only had they come to that place, but they had also brought their friends. This particular suggested translation can be a little bit trickier. You can also just keep it more straightforward. They had brought their friends, and kind of leaving out the tomb as a kind of parenthetical reference. Here's some other information about cum clauses as noted. So the examples we just had would be temporal, but we also have what's called circumstantial. And as your book points out, in this particular case, it explains the cause of the main action or describes a circumstance, hence circumstantial, that might have obstructed the main action or is in some other way opposed to it, and sometimes this is called the adversative or concessive clause. We still translate it using when, since, or although. It just has a slightly different function in terms of grammar. So here we have an example, cum hoc fecisit ad te fugit, when he, so the T indicates T. Here we have also, once again, the pluperfect. When he had done this, he fled to you, although in this particular case, it's in the subjunctive. So if I pull up our Whitaker's words here, you can see we have the pluperfect active subjunctive. But I think we mentioned before when we were talking about subjunctive that although it is in the subjunctive, we can sort of just use our knowledge of English grammar to translate it accordingly. I'm sure that as you look at this example, it may not be obvious why we need the subjunctive. That's just the unique nature of Latin grammar. But we can just think of this as a straightforward pluperfect in terms of our indicative translation. So when he had done this, he fled to you. Since, as always in Latin, oftentimes you'll have to play around with the translations and see which one works best for that context. So here we have cum, when, on each occasion, while, since, although. So this one kind of gives you the full tableau, if you will. And then here is our cum as a preposition, most often just meaning with, followed by the ablative. So as often in Latin, you'll have to play around with the translation to see which one works best for that context. Oftentimes more than one possibility is possible. So here we also have it in the subjunctive, just given the fact that we're going to use, as your book pointed out earlier, that, let's see, I thought it was right here. Yeah, so as you read through this chapter, you'll see how it indicates the use of the subjunctive. This particular example, cum hoc sciret potuit eos juvare. So they're going with since in this one. Since he knew this, he was able to help them. And then cum can also mean although. And here's another example with although. So as always, you'll want to read through this introductory material. It's fairly straightforward. Again, big picture. Going back to the topic is we have cum clauses introducing a clause. The common translation will be when, since, or although. And then we have two different kinds of cum clauses, temporal and also circumstantial. The other main grammar topic in this chapter is the irregular verb ferro, which I think we've seen before, but now they're introducing it more systematically. Anytime you see irregular, what that means in practice is memorize. This is a fairly common verb in Latin, as your book points out, so this is a good one to memorize and to know. And here are our principal parts, ferro, ferre, tuli, latum, and it means to bear or to carry, often used metaphorically, for example, to bear suffering or to bear someone else's actions in a tolerant manner, for example, to bear pain, but it also can mean to carry objects or also to carry oneself in the kind of comportment or manner indicative of Roman values at that time, for example. So read through this. Again, this is a fairly important verb to know. here are our principal parts, and we'll have a couple examples of this verb in today's lesson. Here is an overview or synopsis of that verb. And then, of course, our vocabulary, which needs to be learned. It will be on the test. And as often, make sure you learn the nominative and also the genitive, because it is only the genitive singular. In fact, let me pull up our nouns here. Only the genitive singular has a unique ending. And so by learning the genitive, it helps us to sort and to categorize the different nouns so we know what ending to give them for their particular declension. A lot of these verbs are words that have derivatives in English. So auxiliary, think of like an auxiliary port in your car, kind of trickle charge, for example, also in the military. I don't know if many people refer to their fingers or toes as digits, but you could. I think the meaning is still fairly straightforward. And then here's some nice vocabulary. Elephantos, elephanti, there's a fun word to learn. Exile, as you'll see, oftentimes the S is omitted. Invidia, envy, jealousy, hatred. Rumor, and wine. Ordinary, mediocre. And then here's actually the grammar word. And here's our two grammar points. Cum, conjunction, plus the subjunctive when, since, although. Conjunction, indicative when. So here, this is good to be a little bit more precise. When it's in the subjunctive, then we can use since or although. If it's indicative or temporal, we'll use when. And then we have some other useful vocabulary, including a few verbs and also the main verb in this chapter. You can see the variety of meanings that it can have in Latin. Let's take a look at the sententia antiqui for today. Number one is potesne haec lux esse tibi iucunda cum scies hos omnis concilia tua cognovisse. This one is a little abstract, out of context. Once again, I believe this is a reference to Catiline, which we've encountered on many a times, although I'd have to look into that. Literally what we have is, when we have the ne, we're asking yes-no questions. So, can it be, or is it is it able? So probably, can this light be to you pleasant? This is from Cicero. I assume that the truth of Catiline's conspiracy is what Cicero means by the light, that his scheming and his conspiracy has come to light, that Cicero has pointed out in the Senate in his trial. When you know these all plans have known. So again, this one is a little bit abstract. So let's start with the first part here. Can this light be enjoyable or pleasant for you? So let me go ahead and write that down. If I can type here. And then maybe since people know what you have done, then probably the truth isn't pleasant for you, although the truth is pleasant for those who love the truth, is one part of Cicero's rhetorical meaning in this example. So since you know, so let's go ahead and write that down just to get our place marker. Hos omnes must be, if we look at our Latin declensions, it's a third declension. It could be either nominative plural or accusative plural. Only the context will tell us. So if we go back and look at the context here, since you know that probably in this case, that all of these men are familiar with your plans. Let me write that out and then I'll try to explain that. Since you know that all I think I've mentioned in a previous lesson, often in Cicero you're missing a that. So since I've read enough Cicero at this point, it sort of intuitively made sense to put that in there. Oftentimes his language doesn't have that word, but I think if you look at the sense, you know, well, know what? Know that. It's just a common piece of rhetoric in Cicero's writings. So the host right here is another indication this is in the accusative, because if we look at our endings here, there it is, second declension, accusative, plural. So here we have omnes, hos. I think that is the agreement in this particular example. And then tua consilia is your plans. That is a neuter noun, concilium. We've had that one before. And then we have a cognovice. We'll look this one up. This is a new form for us. I don't think we've seen this one before. This is a perfect active infinitive, but since it's at the end of the sentence, are aware or have become acquainted with or have learned. So you have a couple options right here. But we put it all together, that's probably one way to translate it. Can this light be pleasant for you, since you know that all these men are familiar with your plans? Again, a little bit abstract without background, and it's kind of maybe not the best one to start with in this chapter. Some of these other ones will be a little bit more straightforward. So here we have a reference to the Greeks, another one by Cicero, Themistocles cum Graeciam servitute persica liberaviset, et propto invidiam in exilium expulsus esset, ingratae patre in uriam non tulit quam ferre debuit. So here we have our two grammar concepts in this example. So here we have the infinitive ferre, which is one of the irregular verbs, or the regular verb that's introduced in this chapter, and then cum. So Themistocles was just kind of look this up here. I can't remember his exact date, so I'll look him up myself. An Athenian politician in general. He was one of the new breed of non-aristocratic politicians who rose to prominence in the early years, and so we're looking at the 6th and 5th century, in his case BC, and associated with Athenian democracy. All right, so that is the context for this. Cicero was always admiring the Greeks, and Cicero was the staunchest defender of the Roman Republic, and particularly the virtues of the Greeks. Cicero referred to many, many times, and that's probably the context here, as Cicero was trying to save the Roman Republic against Catiline and other challenges that the Roman Republic had in the 1st century that you're familiar with and we've talked about in passing in this course, and hence his reference to Themistocles. So I'm just going to go ahead and write that down. Themistocles cum, so this could be when, since, or although. You have to play around here. Probably although in this case, just given the fact that, as we see here, apparently he did something, but he wasn't recognized for it. So although he did this happened. And so I can already sense, just scanning it here, that although is probably the best conjunction for this. Again, you have to play around with these to see which one Sense might possibly also work, but I think although is going to be a little bit better. So although, and then here's our verb, although he had liberated or had freed. I don't know enough about ancient Greek politics to know which one would work better in terms of English translation. So I'm going to keep it literal as I tend to do, although he had liberated. Although he had liberated Greece, so here is simply straightforward first declension accusative singular. So there's our direct object. Although he had liberated Greece from, literally from Persian servitude. So I'm going to keep that somewhat literal, and then I'll explain the grammar in greater detail. Maybe Persian tyranny. This is a reference to the Persian wars that were fought between Greece and Persia in the 5th century. Those of you who have seen the movie 300, I think, as a reference to that as well, from a Spartan perspective. And so here we have the ablative of separation. So servitute is third declension ablative singular. And A with the macron is first declension ablative singular. So there's a good example of the ablative, in particular the ablative of separation. And propter means because or on account of. So and on account of, and it's always followed by the accusative. So here is first declension accusative singular, which we noted earlier in the case of graeciam. So there it is, first declension accusative singular. So an account of and on account of the envy. So I'm going to go ahead and write that down. As you know, in Latin, it's important to kind of work your way through the examples, write down what you can, and then go back and fill in what often is missing in the sentence, since reading through it the first time and translating completely is not always possible, especially as you go forward in your Latin. And on account of the envy, this is one of the vocabulary words that we had in our chapter. So invidia, envy, jealousy, hatred. Conceivably, all three of these would work, especially for our purposes. And so, but that is a reference to one of the vocabulary words. And on account of the envy, on account of envy, I guess in this case, I'm going to change that in a second. I already can tell. I'm going to change the article. And on account of envy, he had been expelled into exile. So in that case, expulsus, we can look this up to see what other options are. He had been banished into exile. I'm going to go with that one. So I'm going to use that one right there. He So I mentioned earlier, I'm going to take off the article because I don't think we need it. Latin doesn't have the article, English does, but in this case we'll take it off. It makes more sense stylistically. Themistocles, although he had liberated Greece from Persia servitude, literally the threat of the Persian army, and on account of envy. So I think in English grammar too, I would get rid of that comma, even though the Latin does have the comma there. And on account of envy, actually it does not have a comma. So ingratiae patriae, Here's our verb right here. So he did not. Now we have to figure out, okay, how are we going to translate tulit? This is where we have to go back and look at our examples here. He did not bear, he did not carry, he did not bring, he did not suffer. So I'm saying did not because we're using the third principal part. He did not endure, he did not tolerate, he did not say, he did not report. This one's a little bit tricky. I think the context suggests is that he didn't carry a grudge, or he didn't bear resentment against the fact that he was sent into exile. So I think the first two options are our best bet, based on the Latin that they give us here. So he did not bear inuriam, which is another one of our vocabulary words, I believe. Nope, they don't have that one here. This is where we get the word injury, but I think he did not bear injuries. Not quite what it means here. Let's see, did I spell that correctly? Let's try that again. So he did not bear injury, injustice, wrong, offense. This one's a little bit tricky here. He did not bear an injury. Let me write that down. So this is a good example where we're in chapter 31. As I'm doing right now, even for myself, is I'm translating it, and then I'm going to have to probably go back and rework it into more idiomatic English. But I need to get some basic sense of the original Latin. And of course, the reason why this is so is we're translating it. The main idea is fairly clear, is that Themistocles saved Greece from Persian domination, and he was sent into exile. But nevertheless, he held no resentment against those who had done it, because ultimately he had done it for the sake of Greece. And so he put aside his personal animosities for a higher cause, which is also why Cicero undoubtedly is referencing this. But we're not just reading it and interpreting it, we're translating it, which is a different kind of skill. And so we're just going to have to take our time as we're doing right now. So Themistocles, although he had liberated Greece from servitude and on account, right, and because, and I'm going to change this here, and because of envy. Which propter can mean on account of or because. And on account of envy, he was banished into exile. Probably, I'm just going to throw this in there just because stylistically it makes better sense in English. Nevertheless, he did not bear injury. Nevertheless, they don't give us resent as one of the possible translations for tulit or pharaoh. In fact, that probably normally isn't the case. So I'm going to keep that right there, even though it doesn't sound like the best English. Nevertheless, he did not bear injury. But then injury against what? Into his ungrateful fatherland. So if we go back and look at this one here. So I looked at this chapter before this lesson, and some of the ones after this are a little bit easier to explain. These first two are just slightly more complex. And you bear injury, or you have a sense of being insulted towards someone, is how Latin works it. So this actually is first declension dative singular. There's our AE. And so that's where we're getting that. Nevertheless, he did not bear an injury to his ungrateful fatherland. And then they have this last little clause that he should have carried, literally, or that he should have done, or that he should have. So if we go back, and this is the infinitive for this verb, that he should have bear. Bore, I guess in this case, would be one possibility. That he should have. I'm just going to say that he should have. So I'm translating quam fere debuit is that he should have. So Themistocles, although he had liberated Greece from Persia, servitude, and because maybe we've been putting the nevertheless up here. So Themistocles, although he had liberated Greece from servitude, I'm going to change this a little bit. Nevertheless, now that's not in the original Latin, but because we have a longer sentence, it's just going to be stylistically better, I think. Never. Themistocles, although he had liberated. Well, that actually doesn't work either, so let me change that. Yeah, we'll just keep it at that. That one is kind of tricky to translate. You'll see when we get to Catullus that I already have it queued up here that this is a published translation by a fairly reputable poetry and translation website. And you'll see that often in Latin, especially at this point, we have to take some liberties with the translation, or at least we can, because translating it literally just doesn't work from one language to the other. Okay, so those first two a little bit tricky there. Not grammatically, but just translating. Quae, so here's our cum. So we have since, here's our subjunctive form of sum. So literally, in fact, they're telling us how to translate it here. And since these things are so, that's how we translate that first part. Let's go ahead and write that down. And since these things are so, Catiline, so this is a reference to the conspiracy, which has been mentioned several times in this book. Conferte, that means literally carry yourself into exile. In other words, go into exile. But literally take yourself. So here we have just a compound form of ferro. And you can see it has lots and lots of different possibilities. So gather yourself, oppose yourself, right? Maybe this one right here, gather yourself into exile, actually might be a good one. As you know, in Roman law, it was illegal and against tradition to execute a Roman citizen, and especially someone like Catiline, who was a high member of the Roman Senate. So the sense of this one is get your stuff together, get your house in order, but you're going to have to you're going to be ostracized, from the Roman community. But gather yourself and go now, because you are no longer worthy to be a Roman. So that one I think was fairly straightforward, especially if we just memorize this or learn this as, and since these things were so. And then this is, we're using a cum clause, and here's a good example of the circumstantial use of this conjunction. This actually is in the subjunctive. This is the subjunctive form of the verb to be, and it's just how Latin does it, is we need to use the subjunctive for this particular kind of clause. Quatuor by Horace. And what we have is O navis novi fluctus belli te in mare referent, o quid agis unde erat ullum perfugium. So this one is just kind of knowing the vocabulary in many respects. Is O, ship, new waves of war you in sea they bring. Oh, what are you doing? Whence will any refuge? Right? So the idea here is, remember, Horace was born in 65 BC. The first century was just constant civil war in Rome, in the Roman Republic. And so this is undoubtedly a reference to the fact that here we go again, that it looks like that the menace of war is revealing itself yet again. And of course, Horace, given the fact that the Roman world, in one sense, was a country whose military might, although it was based on the army, they also controlled the seas. And so that reference to the sea, the metaphor of the sea, was just common in the ancient world to describe the winds of fortune, if you will, in this case, war. So let's go ahead and write this down here. So, O ship, O navis, and then new waves. I'll explain the endings on this one, of war. I guess in this case, referant. Let's see, we need to check the tense on this one. I think this is future tense. You can see lots of different possibilities. I guess let's just keep it simple, and will carry or bring. This is a compound form of the verb affero. It just has the prefix re in front of it. So let's go with the two most common translations of this word. Oops. New waves of war will carry you, and then into the sea. Oh, what are you doing? And then unde means from where, but I'm just in the habit of translating it as whence. Will there be any? And then you can probably anticipate this is where we get the word refuge. But let's go ahead and look it up, see if we have any other options. Yeah, so let's go with refuge, asylum, probably not excuse. So when will these wars ever stop is sort of the sense of it. So the ship might even be a metaphor for the Roman Republic. As far as other things that we can note to improve our Latin grammar, notice that fluctus is a fourth declension noun. So there's the u with the macron. But then we have a second declension adjective, novi fluctus, new waves, and then of war, belli. In fact, that here actually is bellum right here, so belli. And then into the sea. Actually in the sea, now that I look at it, because in the ablatives, I'll change that in just a moment. So there's our in mare, because sea is third declension. So let me change that right there. Okay, so that one's fairly straightforward once we know the vocabulary. Number 5, quinque. So here, this actually is in the subjunctive. And so we can start learning that. So you can see it's present active subjunctive. Why is that important? Well, because then we know it's circumstantial. So it's going to be when, since, or although. Temporal will always be when. So that helps. So we just have to trial and error, go with when, since, or although to see which one works here. So maybe although. So although the so cum res publica immortalis esset. So although the republic ought to be immortal, or should be immortal, now of course it isn't and it wasn't is the sense of this by Cicero, who was a witness to the downfall of the Roman Republic. Dolio is one of our verbs in this chapter, I believe. Dolio. So I grieve. So that one's just straightforward I. So I grieve. And again, you can put a different word. You have options there. I grieve, and I mentioned earlier that Cicero, when you read him, we often need a that. So we don't have that here. We don't have quad or anything like that. So just get in the habit of anticipating that in Cicero if you feel like there's something missing. I grieve that. And then here, the eam is actually a reference to the publica, but it's in the accusative singular. So we went from res publica to eam. So this is a personal pronoun in reference to the republic. And then egere means to be without. So again, we're definitely in some trickier Latin here. And it's going to be without, but also you can see here that Latin will use either the genitive or the ablative when it uses this verb. So there's another wrinkle in the complexity of this. And so this one is in the genitive. So we put it all together is that I grieve that she is without salutis, and salutis means health or well-being. So there it is, genitive right there, and health, prosperity, salvation, probably the first two. So I'm going to say health. Just keep it rather straightforward. Although the republic ought to be immortal, I grieve that she is without health. And then it continues here, and I guess in this case, and depends on all right, so I actually have my book open, so I thought I'd just write it out before I try to explain that here. So ac means and. Consistere, they give us that right down here, and then remember if it's in italics, we're going to use that. And depends on literally the life of one mortal. In other words, that like Socrates, you have to be willing to risk your life, Cicero argues, in order to save higher things. Emerson, the writer in the American tradition, the 19th century writer, was part of this tradition of Republican humanism. He famously said that everything good in man leans on something higher. And so we see that is an idea and sense of life that goes all the way back to Cicero and the Greeks, Plato in particular. And so it literally depends on, and then depends on what? The life, literally, of one's mortality, that you have to be willing to give your life is the sense of that. Just as Socrates did, as we learn in the Apology. Okay, moving on to number 6. Number 6, cum illum hominum esse servorum novicet, eum comprehendere non dubitavit. So this is in the subjunctive. How do we know that? Well, we can look it up, but I'll just tell you that it is. So when it's in the subjunctive, we have 3 options: when, since, or although. Sometimes more than one works. Let's just try when. So when he had known that man to be a slave. That one's actually fairly straightforward. So T is third person singular. So when he had known that man to be a slave. Notice here we have accusative singular, accusative singular, accusative singular. Of course, is second declension, accusative singular. Third declension, accusative singular. So that one is fairly straightforward. Now, known can also mean like recognized. When he had known that man. So in this instance, Cicero actually does use that, but he uses it as a demonstrative pronoun. Dubitavit, that's where we get the words dubious, or the opposite, indubitable. He did not doubt, although it could be doubt, but he did not hesitate to apprehend him. Another good example of what's required in Latin, we're just going to have to look up some of these words. It's not comprehend. That doesn't make a lot of sense. So if we look this word up, once again, you have options: catch, seize, grasp, which is a kind of comprehension, but in a different context. Arrest, so you could say arrest as well. Ignite, maybe not that one. He's not setting him on fire. Conceive, I don't think they're having a baby together. Embrace. So you can see Latin much more rich in its possibilities in this respect than English, just given the need to interpret language, which was one of the achievements of the ancient world, that meanings don't come fully revealed and ready to grasp, but rather it takes some thought, some effort by individuals, by human beings, in order to comprehend the nature of things. And so he didn't hesitate to apprehend, or if you want to say arrest him, that would work as well. But then they give us a kind of, another option is literally he having been arrested. Let's go ahead and write that down and see where that takes us here. I do recommend when you're reading Latin, and especially translating, that you use punctuation. In this case, we have a comma. And so let's go ahead and write that down, because we're not going to be able to remember all the translations in our head normally. And so you got to work your way. This is where Latin is like math and science. You have to work your way through the language in order to translate it, especially given the fact that Latin is an inflected language. So he, having been arrested, or detained. Now, I did keep it as a kind of passive paraphrastic. If you want to say after he had been arrested, that would work too, but we do need to recognize that we have a participle here, which needs to be interpreted in the past tense. Although, so cum primo means although at first. So that might be something you could memorize. Although at first, he began literally to respond impudently. You could actually, impudent is kind of brazenly, or I didn't do it, or basically before the Miranda rights, they didn't have Miranda rights back then, is most people, they confess when they talk. They reveal a lot of things about themselves when they talk. And a lot of times, if somebody has done something wrong, when people talk, you can tell just by their words, by their tone, that they're guilty. And then when you compare what they said to the facts, it doesn't match. And so that's sort of the sense here, right? Impudentur is our adverb here, but let's see what else we have here. Shamelessly or impudently, maybe shamelessly. Let's go with shamelessly. So, although at first he began although, cum primum, although at first he began, caepicit. So caepicit is he began. To respond, there's our infinitive respondere, and then we just talked about that adverb. Tama means nevertheless, so let's put that in there. Oops. Nevertheless, kind of in the end, he denied, like in the end. So notice I've added a few more words just based on the sense of the sentence. So in the end, denique, nevertheless, he denied nothing. In fact, that would be even shorter, right? So nevertheless, in the end, he denied nothing. Nevertheless, in the end, he nothing. There we go. Nihil means nothing. All right, moving on. Let's see. Here we have a reference to a famous athlete, a famous Greek athlete, Milo. Of course, we think of the Olympic Games. So we have Milo dicetur per stadium venisse cum bovum umere feret. This one's fairly straightforward. Is Milo is said. So there's our passive, but we just translate that as is said. That's a fairly common phrasing in Latin. So let's go ahead and write that down. As you'll see, like he is said to have done this is sort of the sense of this. So, and then to have come through the stadium. So venisse is, we talked about this earlier. This one, don't let the fancy grammar term scare you, but it is a perfect active infinitive, but probably the best advice is just to learn how to read it and translate it. So to have come is how we, because the infinitive means to, and then the perfect active have come, and then you can see that's what it means. So he is said to have come through, or you can say to the stadium, through the stadium, carrying or so I guess when he was carrying um, a ox on his shoulders, okay, or when he carried. So this one we can check our tense by. So it's in the past tense. So when he carried. As you know, the ancients, they loved a good spectacle. So imagine Milo carrying an ox on his shoulders. I normally do that every Saturday morning. I walk up and down the street carrying an ox. Sometimes I get looks, but apparently at one time it could make you famous. Number 9. Number 9 is a lovely one. We're almost done here, as you'll see, the poem, which is pretty awesome, but I pulled up a translation, so we'll be able to get through that fairly quickly. Quid vesper et somnis ferant incertum est, Livy, the great Roman historian. This is a nice one here. What evening and sleep bring is uncertain. Maybe the best one we've had so far. Very nice. So quid is what? Evening and sleep. If you have insomnia, you can't sleep. So somnia. Somnus is sleep in Latin. And then ferant is simply bring or carry. This is our verb. Again, very common in Latin, not just in this chapter, but Latin more generally. And then even someone who has had no Latin could probably venture what this means is uncertain. All right. Yeah, I think I'll stop on that one. We're going to stop on a high note with the Sententia Antiqua, at least, because that one is just a lovely sentence. Here, for the poem by Catullus, I pulled up just some background information. We've had Catullus before. One of the most famous writers in the history of poetry, and certainly very important for Roman literature and literary Latin. And just a brief background on Catullus. Let's see, he was born, let's see, I thought I pulled that up here, but Catullus, 84 to 54 BC, so he lived 30 years. And you can see he wrote on a variety of subjects. And surprisingly, he's very anticipatory and very near to what we would understand as poetry today. As you know, literary Latin is very different than modern literature in terms of language. It functions with different levels of meaning. For example, the allegorical, which is less and less common as you move forward in the history of literature, and certainly in the 20th and now 21st centuries, where allegorical language as the ancients understood it and practiced it is nearly invisible in contemporary literature. But in the case of Catullus, given the fact that he wrote poems, the continuity of the tradition from the Greeks, Romans to today is fairly evident in his prodigious literary output. The poem we have for today is one of the more famous ones, number 5. And if we just compare, so what I've done is I pulled this up here, and this is actually the original. So we're at the point now we're actually reading original Latin, hence why the Latin is getting a little bit trickier. And you have some other background information right here about this famous poem. Remember, Carmen means song or poem. And this one is Give Me 1,000 Kisses. And this one we can go through almost word for word and see how it functions in terms of a published translation. So let's take a look at this famous poem. Vivamos mea lesbia atque amemus, remorasque senum severorum omnis unius aestimemus assis. Soles occidere et redere possunt, nobis cum semel occidit brevis lux, nox est perpetua una dormienda, da mi basia mille diende centum. Dein mille altera, dein secunda centum. Dende usque altera mille diende centum. Dien cum millia multe fece erimus, conturbabimus illa ne sciamus. Aut ne quis malus invidere possit, cum tantum sciat esse passiorum. So we look right here is, let us live, my Lesbia. And Lesbia, I thought they might have some information about her, but they don't. But Lesbia was actually the wife of a Roman senator and aristocrat, and they had some kind of dalliance or liaison, and that's who is referenced here. So let us live, my Lesbia, let us love. And the original Latin is, here we have the subjunctive, let us live, my Lesbia, and let us love. And so, viva vivere, amo amare, you may recall all the way back in chapter 1, these verbs, and now we're seeing them in the subjunctive, not the indicative, and a kind of hortatory subjunctive as a kind of ideal love and life. So let us live, my Lesbia, and let us love. In all the worlds of the old and so moral. This is where they've taken a little bit of poetic freedom in the translation. You can find other translations of this online. The original Latin was, and the rumors and strictures of old men. Literally, if somebody is severe or severus. But the original Latin, again, this is the original Latin, is, you'll see, let's put aside the rumors and the censorships of these old men who really don't know anything about love anymore, is sort of the context here. But you can sort of see how translation can be interesting, because they're saying in all the worlds of old and so moral, or excuse me, in all the words. Do we have words in the original Latin? No, we have rumors, not verba. And so that's kind of interesting. But then what he's saying is that also let's estimate all of their opinions as one ass. Now, an ass was a unit. This is actually one of your vocabulary words. It's a small copper coin, basically a penny, is so not worth very much. And so that's, and of course, one of the many things that Catullus is doing in this wonderful poem is distinguishing between the materiality of language and its more symbolic function or meanings, and suggesting how many people, this was a common theme in ancient literature, they tend to view life and love in material terms, whereas life and love, according to the poem, are different than matter, different than materiality, and in one sense cannot be communicated, and if so, only poorly. In this case, as unius assis, only poorly, if life and love are communicated in material terms. Hence, love and life seem to require, again, this is a common theme in ancient literature, and we see it in this poem, seem to require a different kind of language, a different kind of thought, a different kind of relationship to one another in language. may they be worth less than nothing to us. And so that is the omnis unios, let us estimate them as one ass. And then he's saying here is that literally as the suns set and return, so suns may set and suns may rise again. So soles set and then fall, and then are able to return. But when our brief light has set, in other words, when our life is over, Catullus himself only lived to age 30. So here they're saying, but when, right, our brief life has set to us, in other words, but since, right, our life is very short or very brief, that soon there will be perpetual night and a constant sleep. Think of dormant. And so life is short. Let us seize the day by loving and living, and not as many neither do nor seemingly want nor understand. So night, but when our brief life has set, night is one long everlasting sleep. Give me 1,000 kisses, 1,000 more. So here's our imperative. Give me 1,000 kisses, then 100 more. Then another 1,000, then another 100. And so kind of going back here, 100 more, another 1,000. And again, this is the original Latin, so it should be satisfying to be able to read this, probably even without a translation. You could probably have some sense of what is going on here. Then let us, literally make 1,000 more, right? When we've counted up the many thousands, confuse them so as not to know them all. That was a little bit trickier. Think of like turba, confuse them not, lest we know them all. So that no enemy may cast an evil eye. So that no one who is bad is able to envy us, is kind of the more literally translation of that. By knowing that there were so many kisses, since he knows there to be so many, literally of the kisses, but in English, so many kisses. So I would encourage you to, to kind of compare the two. Once again, if you Google other translations of Catullus Carmen number 5, you'll see changes in the translation. The translation is always an interpretation, but I want to say that, especially with a dictionary, you could probably read through this and translate it with great success. So give it a go. I think once you know that the verbs are in the subjunctive and you have a little bit of context, few tricky grammatical constructs. The nay is always somewhat tricky, I think, but it just means not. And there's some additional help here as well in case you need it. All right, that was it for today. Carpe diem, and we will see you next time.